They had met at Lady Berkshire's the night that Rubinstein played there, and after that used to be always seen together at the opera, and wherever good music was going on. For 18 months their intimacy lasted. There's that word intimacy again. Campbell was always either at Selby Royale or at Grosvenor Square. To him, as to many others, Dorian Gray was the type of everything that is wonderful and fascinating in life. Whether or not a quarrel had taken place between them, no one ever knew, but suddenly people remarked that they scarcely spoke when they met, and that Campbell seemed always to go away early from any party at which Dorian Gray was present. He had changed too, was strangely melancholy at times, appeared almost to dislike hearing music, and would never himself play, giving as his excuse, when he was called upon, that he was so absorbed in science that he had no time left in which to practice. And this was certainly true. Every day he seemed to become more and more interested in biology, and his name appeared once or twice in some of the scientific reviews in connection with certain curious experiments. So a couple of things on Alan Campbell. We talked about his artistic leaning towards music, which is a scientific sort of art form. I think there's a lot of cool overlap there. And that's how he met Dorian Gray. But then they had this sort of breakup. And this is more sort of bisexual hints, I think, about Dorian as a character coming across. We had a lot of those when Basil was talking to him about Adrian Singleton and various other gentlemen that he spent a lot of time with. But this breakup that seems to have happened between Dorian and Alan is a callback to the breakup maybe between Sybil Vane and himself. Alan seems to have gone into a deep depression. He's given up art entirely and focused his whole life on science. And maybe that's an indication, again, that he's symbolic of science here, or the opposition of science and art, the ways they can be in harmony, such as in music, and the ways that they can be opposed to each other. This was the man Dorian Gray was waiting for. Every second, he kept glancing at the clock. Actually, pause, I forgot to mention something, too, that I think is interesting. It said at the end of that last paragraph that Alan became more and more interested in biology, and his name appeared in connection with scientific experiments, curious experiments. That's a very Frankenstein moment. Are we going back to sort of the gothic nature of the novel, sort of a callback to that earlier work? I think maybe. And the story, we talked about Frankenstein like in the early lectures about this, but this story is interestingly an opposite of Frankenstein in a lot of ways. It's like an inversion of the Frankenstein structure. So it's clear to me that Wilde had read Frankenstein and was playing on Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a story about a monster who has a good heart, a good soul, but a horrible, murderous external appearance. He's a monster, and everybody treats him as a monster, and so he has to accept simply being a monster, whereas Dorian is somebody who has a monster soul but a beautiful appearance. And so he's always treated well, which allows him to continue in his monstrosity. You can see how they're opposites in, I think, a really powerful way. This was the man Dorian Gray was waiting for. Every second he kept glancing at the clock. As the minutes went by, he became horribly agitated. At last, he got up and began to pace up and down the room, looking like a beautiful caged thing. He took long, stealthy strides. His hands were curiously cold. The suspense became unbearable. Time seemed to him to be crawling with feet of lead, more personification here, while he, by monstrous winds, was being swept toward the jagged edge of some black cleft or precipice. He knew what was waiting for him there, saw it indeed, and shuddering, crushed with dank hands his burning lids, as though he would have robbed the very brain of sight and driven the eyeballs back into their cave. It was useless. The brain had its own food on which it battened, and the imagination, made grotesque by terror, twisted and distorted as a living thing by pain, danced like some foul puppet on a stand. Now that's probably a direct reference as to a puppet on a stand being, him on a rope if he were to hang for his crime of murdering Basil. It's clearly on his mind. It's showing up in various ways. Then suddenly time stopped. That's a metaphor. Time doesn't stop. Time stopped for him. Yes, that blind, slow-breathing thing crawled no more, and horrible thoughts, time being dead, raced nimbly on in front and dragged a hideous future from its grave and showed it to him. He stared at it. Its very horror made him stone. At last the door opened and his servant entered. He turned glazed eyes upon him. "Mr. Campbell, sir," said the man. A sigh of relief broke from his parched lips, and the color came back to his cheeks. "Ask him to come in at once, Francis." He felt that he was himself again. His mood of cowardice had passed away. The man bowed and retired. In a few moments, Alan Campbell walked in, looking very stern and rather pale, his pallor being intensified by his coal black hair and dark eyebrows. Alan, this is kind of you. I thank you for coming. I had intended never to enter your house again, Gray. But you said it was a matter of life and death. His voice was hard and cold. He spoke with slow deliberation, almost scientifically, right? There was a look of contempt in the steady, searching gaze that he turned on Dorian. He kept his hands in the pockets of his astrakhan coat and seemed not to have noticed the gesture with which he had been greeted. I think he ignored a handshake here. It's not stated clearly, but that's implied. So there's definitely still a distance between them, just physically in the way that they're interacting with each other. Yes, it is a matter of life and death, Alan. And to more than one person. Sit down. Campbell took a chair by the table, and Dorian sat opposite to him. The two men's eyes met. In Dorian's there was infinite pity. He knew what he was going to do was dreadful. After a strained moment of silence, he leaned across and said very quietly, but watching the effect of each word upon the face of him he had sent for, Alan, in a locked room at the top of this house, a room to which nobody but myself has access, a dead man is seated at a table. He has been dead 10 hours now. Don't stir. And don't look at me like that. Who the man is, why he died, and how he died are matters that do not concern you. What you have to do is this. Now, here's Dorian being the spectator of his own life again. He's watching, quote, watching the effect of each word upon the face he had sent for. So not only is he telling this thing that concerns himself dreadfully to Alan, but he's enjoying the effect his words have on Alan. That's sort of weird. Stop, Gray. I don't want to know anything further. Whether what you have told me is true or not does not concern me. I entirely decline to be mixed up in your life. Keep your horrible secrets to yourself. They don't interest me anymore. Alan, they will have to interest you. This one will have to interest you. I am awfully sorry for you, Alan, but I can't help myself. You're the only man who was able to save me. I am forced to bring you into the matter. I have no option. Alan, you are scientific. You know about chemistry and things of that kind. You have made experiments. Pause. What? He's an idiot. I mean, like, I really think, you are scientific, you know about chemistry and things of that kind, you have made experiments. I mean, like, it shows his utter ignorance of science. In all the things he's studied, he's only ever studied art and a little bit of religion, and he's never bothered to look into science. No. But again, here's Alan representing science and Dorian representing art, two very clear elements of a binary that are opposed to each other in a new and interesting way. This is no longer Dorian as opposed to Basil, or Dorian as opposed to Lord Henry, or Lord Henry as opposed to Basil. This is a new interaction. Dorian and Alan, art and science. What you've got to do is destroy the thing that is upstairs. To destroy it so as not a vestige of it will be left. Nobody saw this person come into the house. Indeed, at the present moment, he is supposed to be in Paris. He will not be missed for months. When he is missed, there must be no trace of him found here. You, Alan, you must change him and everything that belongs to him into a handful of ashes that I may scatter in the air. You're mad, Dorian. Ah, I was waiting for you to call me Dorian. Again, that's a hint at a former relationship. You are mad, I tell you, mad to imagine that I would raise a finger to help you. Mad to make this monstrous confession. I will have nothing to do with the matter, whatever it is. Do you think I am going to peril my reputation for you? What is it to me what devil's work you are up to? Devil's work. Lord Henry? It was suicide, Alan. I'm glad of that. But who drove him to it? You, I should fancy. So again, there's another Sybil Vane callback here. It wasn't suicide. And by the way, Dorian is dumb again. Like, if Alan goes up and does this thing, he's going to know it wasn't suicide. He, stabbed him in the back of the head behind the ear. Who can do that to themselves 7 times with a knife? He's lying and he doesn't think through his lies. I'm glad of that, but what drove him to it? You, I should fancy. Do you still refuse to do this for me? Of course I refuse. I will have absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't care what shame comes on you. You deserve it all. I should not be sorry to see you disgraced, publicly disgraced. How dare you ask me, of all men in the world, to mix myself up in this horror? I should have thought you knew more about people's characters. Your friend Lord Henry Wotton can't have taught you very much about psychology, whatever else he has taught you. Nothing will induce me to stir a step to help you. You have come to the wrong man. Go to some of your friends. Don't come to me. Alan, It was murder. I killed him. You don't know what he made me suffer. Whatever my life is, he had more to do with the making or the marring of it than poor Harry has had. He may not have intended it, but the result was the same. Murder? Good God, Dorian, is that what you've come to? I shall not inform upon you. It is not my business. Besides, without my stirring in the matter, you are certain to be arrested. Nobody ever commits a crime without doing something stupid. But I will have nothing to do with it. You must have something to do with it. Wait a moment. Listen to me. Only listen, Alan. All I ask of you is to perform a certain scientific experiment. You go to hospitals and dead houses, and the horrors that you do there don't affect you. If, in some hideous dissecting room or fetid laboratory, you found this man lying on the leaden table with red gutters scooped out in it for the blood to flow through, you would simply look on it as an admirable subject. You would not turn a hair. You would not believe that you were doing anything wrong. On the contrary, you would probably feel that you were benefiting the human race, or increasing the sum of knowledge of the world, or gratifying intellectual curiosity, or something of that kind. What I want you to do is merely what you have often done before. Indeed, to destroy a body must be far less horrible than what you're accustomed to work at. And remember, it is the only piece of evidence against me. If it is discovered, I am lost. And it is sure to be discovered unless you can help me. Pause. This is him trying to justify the covering up of the murder to Alan in sort of a pretty clunky way, trying to use his own psychology or his own ideas against him. But Dorian's clearly not as good at that as Lord Henry is. I have no desire to help you. You forget that. I am simply indifferent to the whole thing. It has nothing to do with me. Alan, I entreat you. Think of the position I am in. Just before you came in, I almost fainted with terror. You know terror yourself. You may know terror yourself someday. No, don't think of that. Look at the matter purely from the scientific point of view. You don't inquire where the dead things on which you experiment come from. Don't inquire now. I have told you too much as it is. I beg of you to do this. We were friends once, Alan. Don't speak about those days, Dorian. They are dead. The dead linger sometimes. The man upstairs will not go away. He is sitting at the table with a bowed head and outstretched arms. Alan, if you don't come to my assistance, I am ruined. Why, they will hang me, Alan. Don't you understand? They will hang me for what I have done. There is no good in prolonging the scene. I absolutely refuse to do anything in the matter. It is insane of you to ask me. You refuse? Yes. I entreat you, Alan. It is useless. The same look of pity came into Dorian's eyes. Then he stretched out his hand, took a piece of paper, and wrote something on it. He read it over twice, folded it carefully, and pushed it across the table. Having done this, he got up and went over to the window. Campbell looked at him in surprise, then took up the paper and opened it. As he read it, his face became ghastly pale, and he fell back in his chair. A horrible sense of sickness came over him. He felt as if his heart were beating itself to death in some empty hollow. After 2 or 3 minutes of terrible silence, Dorian turned round and came and stood behind him, putting his hand upon his shoulder. I am sorry for you, Alan, he murmured, but you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I must send it. If you don't help me, I will send it. You know what the result will be. But you are going to help me. It is impossible for you to refuse now. I tried to spare you. You will do me the justice to admit that. You treated me as no man has ever dared to treat me. No living man, at any rate. I bore it all. Now it is for me to dictate terms. So clearly this is blackmail, if you're following along. What is he blackmailing him with? I mean, we can speculate. But probably they're in what from the time period would be called an indecent relationship. Remember that being gay was illegal, and Oscar Wilde, being found gay, was sent to a work camp and disgraced. So is he, suggesting that this is what he's blackmailing Alan with? I think so. I think it makes sense. But we don't know for sure. There's no way to know from the evidence that's available in the story. It's just all circumstantial. Campbell buried his face in his hands, and a shudder passed through him. Yes, it is my turn to dictate terms, Alan. You know what they are. The thing is quite simple. Come, don't work yourself into this fever. The thing has to be done. Face it, and do it. A groan broke from Campbell's lips, and he shivered all over. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to him to be dividing Tom into separate atoms of agony. Look at the diction here. This is scientific diction, atoms of agony. We're in Campbell's point of view for a brief second, and you can already see his scientific nature. Wilde knows what he's doing. each of which was too terrible to be borne. He felt as if an iron ring were being slowly tightened round his forehead, as if the disgrace with which he was threatened had already come upon him. The hand upon his shoulder weighed like a hand of lead. It was intolerable. It seemed to crush him. Come, Alan, you must decide at once. I cannot do it, he said mechanically, as though words could alter things. You must. You have no choice. Don't delay. He hesitated for a moment. Is there a fire in the room upstairs? Yes, there's a gas fire with asbestos. I shall have to go home and get some things from the laboratory. No, Alan, you must not leave the house. Write out a sheet of notepaper, what you want, and my servant will take a cab and bring the things back to you. Now, why doesn't he let Alan leave? Because Alan would maybe, bolt or commit suicide or something, right? You just have to follow that line of reasoning a little bit. Campbell scrawled a few lines blotted them and addressed an envelope to his assistant. Dorian took the note up and read it carefully. Then he rang the bell and gave it to his valet with orders to return as soon as possible and to bring the things with him. As the hall door shut, Campbell started nervously, and having got up from the chair, went over to the chimney-piece. He was shivering with a kind of ague. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of the men spoke. A fly buzzed noisily around the room, and the ticking of the clock was like the beat of a hammer. There's a simile for you. As the chime struck 1, Campbell turned round, and looking at Dorian, saw that his eyes were filled with tears. There was something in the pity and refinement of that sad face that seemed to enrage him. "You are infamous, absolutely infamous," he muttered. "Hush, Alan, you have saved my life," said Dorian. "Your life? Good heavens, what a life that is. You have gone from corruption to corruption, and now you have culminated in crime. In doing what I now do, what you force me to do, it is not of your life that I am thinking." "Ah, Alan," murmured Dorian with a sigh, "I wish you had 1,000th part of the pity for me that I have for you." He turned away as he spoke and stood looking out at the garden. There's the garden again. I mean, obviously English backyards are called gardens, but Oscar Wilde uses this metaphorically to sort of touch base with the idea of sin and original sin over and over again. Campbell made no answer. After about 10 minutes, a knock came on the door, and the servant entered carrying a large mahogany chest of chemicals with a long coil of steel and platinum wire, and 2 rather curiously shaped iron clamps. "Shall I leave the things here, sir?" he asked Campbell. "Yes," said Dorian, "and I'm afraid, Francis, I have another errand for you. What is the name of the man at Richmond who supplies Selby with orchids?" "Harden, sir." "Yes, Harden. You must go down to Richmond at once, see Harden personally, and tell him to send twice as many orchids as I ordered, and to have as few white ones as possible. In fact, I don't want any white ones." Pause. White is a symbol of purity. I think this is an interesting, we've talked about the language of flowers throughout here, but he doesn't want any white orchids. That's interesting. "It's a lovely day, Francis, and Richmond is a very pretty place. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother you about it." "No trouble, sir. At what time shall I be back?" Dorian looked at Campbell. "How long will your experiment take, Alan?" he said in a calm, indifferent voice. The presence of a third person in the room seemed to give him extraordinary courage. Campbell frowned and bit his lip. "It will take about 5 hours," he answered. "It will be time enough then if you are back at 7:30. Francis, or stay and just leave my things out for dressing. You can have the evening to yourself. I am not dining at home, so I shall not want you." "Thank you, sir," said the man, leaving the room. "Now, Alan, there is not a moment to be lost. How heavy this chest is! I'll take it for you. You bring the other things." He spoke rapidly and in an authoritative manner. Campbell felt dominated by him. Is that a reference to Lord Henry dominating Dorian? How many times we've heard that phrase? Then they left the room together. When they reached the top landing, Dorian took out the key and turned it in the lock. Then he stopped, and a troubled look came into his eyes. He shuddered. "I don't think I can go in, Alan," he murmured. "It's nothing to me. I don't require you," said Campbell coldly. Dorian half opened the door. As he did so, he saw the face of his portrait leering in the sunlight. On the floor in front of it, the torn curtain was lying. He remembered the night before he had forgotten, for the first time in his life, to hide the fatal canvas, and was about to rush forward when he drew back with a shudder. What was that loathsome red dew that gleamed wet and glistening on one of the hands as though the canvas had sweated blood? Blood on his hands? I mean, I don't think you can get more literal than that in terms of symbolism. How horrible it was. More horrible it seemed to him for the moment than the silent thing that he knew was stretched across the table. The thing whose grotesque, misshapen shadow on the spotted carpet showed him that it had not stirred, but was still there as he had left it. More concerned with art than reality. He's more concerned about the picture than he is about the death of Basil. He calls Basil a grotesque thing, as opposed to the picture, which seems very alive and real to him. I'll just leave that observation there. He heaved a deep breath, opened the door a little wider, and with half-closed eyes and averted head, walked quickly in, determined that he would not look once upon the dead man. Then, stooping down and taking up the gold and purple hanging, he flung it right over the picture. There he stopped, feeling afraid to turn round, and his eyes fixed themselves on the intricacies of the pattern before him. He heard Campbell bringing in the heavy chest and the irons, and the other things that he required for his dreadful work. He began to wonder if he and Basil Hallward had ever met, and if so, what they had thought of each other. That's, a fun line if Basil's God and he's science. "Leave me now," said the stern voice behind him. He turned and hurried out, just conscious that the dead man had been thrust back into the chair and that Campbell was gazing into a glistening yellow face. As he was going downstairs, he heard the key being turned in the lock. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was pale, but absolutely calm. "I have done what you asked me to do," he muttered. "And now goodbye. Let us never see each other again." "You have saved me from ruin, Alan. I cannot forget that," said Dorian simply. As soon as Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell of nitric acid in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. It's the end of chapter 14. Basil's body has been disintegrated with nitric acid and electrical fire and, asbestos. It's sort of disturbing. And he blackmailed Alan into doing it. But hold up! This is a really interesting development. I closed the book. But if Alan Campbell represents science, okay, let's just throw that out there. Not even far enough. If Alan Campbell represents science, then and Dorian is humanity and Basil's God, what we have here maybe allegorically is that humanity just murdered God and covered up the murder with science, saying there never was a Basil in the room to begin with. Given that Darwin had just come out and that science was a really big deal in the Victorian age, and that a bunch of religious people who have sort of that medieval moral, emotional mindset that Oscar Wilde is showing in a character like Basil are very upset about the changes that science is bringing on life and maybe on morality and moral viewpoints and accepted fact. This is a really interesting development to have science covering up the death of God. But that humanity killed God. If Victorian humanity murdered morality, murdered the idea of God and replaced it with science, that's a fascinating idea. And we can go back through the earlier parts of the book and consider that. But what if intellectualism murdered emotion or murdered morality? Or what if science killed religion? There's lots of ways that you could take this allegorically if you want to go there. And I think you should. I think it's fascinating to do this. So I'm just going to leave it with you. I'm going to let you think about this and consider and ponder. And we'll come back and read chapter 15 next time. Hope you're enjoying The Picture of Dorian Gray. I love the book. I think we're getting into some really exciting stuff here. So if you have comments, send me an email, and I will happily respond. See ya.